be arrested and held 6 months without charge or trial, not seeing what is against them, and then be kept for another 6 months and another 6 months, etc. Child detention, as I've just mentioned, consciential objectors I was starting to talk to you about. Amnesty will look at the cases of young Israelis who object to serving in the occupied territories. Discrimination, that's largely to do what this report is dealing with. That includes family reunification, which we will come to. Excessive force I've mentioned also. Gaza obviously is a situation on its own. It's a chronic humanitarian situation of 14, 15 years standing there. House demolitions, we'll go into detail on these as we go along. The movement restrictions, that's just the impossibility for any Palestinian to just move freely around any of the occupied territories, or in out of Gaza or to and from East Jerusalem and the occupied territories. And the settlements, which are very much the nub of the problem, the illegal settlements, or colonies I prefer to call them, which are being planted on occupied Palestinian territory. Now, what I'm going to do is just quickly show, this is in terms of defining apartheid, this is just an amnesty, very short amnesty intro film.
Apartheid isn't just a description of what happened in South Africa. It is also a crime against humanity under international law. Israel is committing the crime of apartheid throughout the occupied Palestinian territories and within Israel. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, committed with the specific intent of maintaining a cruel system of control by one racial group over another. Israel has imposed a racist system of oppression and domination over Palestinians that amounts to apartheid, and it's time to dismantle this system. For over 73 years, Israel has forced
just a backup. Okay, that video is basically going to go into a very broad definition of apartheid. It comes from human rights law, and is part of laws that many countries around the world have signed up to through the UN. Israel is a signatory to one of the facets of those laws on apartheid. And apartheid itself is a crime against humanity. So anywhere that is found to actually be operating that system really should be brought to attention on the UN and an International Criminal Court, and any perpetrators also brought to task as well.
Forcibly displaced entire Palestinian communities and demolished hundreds of thousands of Palestinian homes and structures. Today, over 150,000 Palestinians face losing their homes, while 6 million remain as refugees. Palestinians live under a system of racial segregation, road closures, checkpoints, apartheid walls, and legal status based on residence or control Palestinian lives. They keep families apart and oppress the population wherever they live. Israel's aim is to maintain control over the land and demography, and so it bars Palestinian refugees from returning home. Some families have been displaced for generations. Palestinians living under apartheid in Gaza, the West Bank, and throughout Israel have been calling out apartheid for generations. For too long, Israel has been getting away with crimes against humanity. But change is possible. It is time to dismantle apartheid, and the first step is to call it what it is. End Israel's apartheid. Apartheid.
No. Yeah. So this research, in terms of Amnesty recognizing late in the day, some people would say apartheid in Israel and occupied territories. It's 4 years of research. It started in 2008, 2017, 18, One thing that gave it a spin in 2018 was the introduction of the basic national law in Israel, which basically states that Israel is a state of the Jewish people. It's a Jewish nation. It also excludes the 21% who are of Jewish descent. It runs to 300 pages, 280 pages. There is a briefer version, an 8-page summary coming out. You'll be very glad to hear. And there are 51 recommendations, which are for Israel, obviously, primarily to cease what it's doing, to cease the policies and practices of apartheid. Also to the international community and third-party states to actually recognize that apartheid as a crime against humanity is something they should be considering and acting on in terms of bringing people to court for that. And also to businesses as a side issue, businesses which Amnesty again has looked at in the past, businesses operating in illegal settlements particularly, and funding and helping those economies run. Again, coming back to that definition, there are a few keywords here. Inhuman or inhumane treatment has to be enacted. That doesn't have to be violence. It can be just the removal of somebody's rights. It's got to be institutionalized. So the whole state apparatus, it's got to be everything from depth from legal apparatus, the economic, every, militarily, every resource really available to a state is actually used to maintain the regime. And the reason for it is to oppress and dominate one racial group. Now, in terms of racial groups, Palestinians are defined as a racial group. We're not just talking about black and white here. We are talking about, literally, we're talking about the fact that Palestinians are a recognizable social and cultural group. They're easily recognized. They're recognized certainly by the Israeli authorities as being a distinct group. And that's the reason they are acted against with the apartheid policies, because they're recognized as being non-Jewish. Now, the findings speak for themselves, really. Basically, all the evidence gathered. Now, it's from Amnesty's own research over the years. There was enough of that to start with. You've got Human Rights Watch, you've got B'Tselem, you've got Palestinian human rights groups that have been working for years, obviously, on these issues. You've got the UN releasing reports, which people don't take too much notice of. But there was enough research, enough evidence to finally state that an apartheid regime is being operated within Israel and the occupied territories against the Palestinians, obviously. And to such a degree that Palestinians are being treated as an inferior racial group. So basically, it's stating that the research has proved, as far as Amnesty was concerned, alongside there was external examination of the reasoning. There were legal experts in apartheid internationally who looked at the report. It's gone through several revisions, several reviews. So this is the final product after quite a lot of work's being done into it internally and externally over a 4-year period. So it's not something that's been produced rashly. Now, this is done by 4 areas. It's 4 areas of strategy in terms of having a system of apartheid, how you can manage that. Fragmentation into domains of control. These are all things that I'll break down as we go along. But that's about really divide and conquer. It's basically that. Segregation control, similarly, you're keeping the racial group, the subgroup, clearly separated from your own people. And certainly the apartheid project in Israel occupied territories, the whole intent has been to actually maintain the privilege of the Israeli Jewish peoples. And that does involve obviously dispossessing the racial group you're oppressing, dispossessing them of land and property. So that comes from the Palestinians losing land and property in 48 and not being allowed to actually gain any from that period as well. And deprivation of economic and social rights. We'll go more into that, but you're talking about right to family life, right to free speech, all the normal rights we all enjoy here, certainly, but also not being able to develop your working life and develop your economy. Now, the first part of that fragmentation, you don't think of it to go see that map on the right-hand side very well, but it shows where the Palestinian population is is distributed. Now, what happened last May? If you remember last May, there was the attacks on Gaza, the hostilities between Gaza and Israel. And as a result of that, they actually followed what was happening in East Jerusalem, which was the planned eviction of a number of families in Silwan, Sheikh Jarrah, excuse me. And also then there were riots in occupied territories. And then also what you had hostilities within Israel itself by Palestinian communities. Now that was one of the first occasions where that fragmentation of these Palestinian peoples actually all took action around about the same time, which broke through this whole strategy of Israel, which has been to keep those populations separate, because it's much easier to rule those Palestinian groups in those areas if they don't have much communication with each other. They're not allowed to communicate very much with each other, and certainly not mingle in any physical way. So you've got the Gaza Palestinians, and you've got the Occupied Palestinian Territories, which themselves have been fragmented by the Israeli settlements. And then you've got the Israeli Arabs, who are Palestinian root, and also then you've got the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So those groups are all dealt with very differently and kept separate. Now that is one way of maintaining control and being able to oppress a racial group. That mass displacement, it happened in 48. It continues to happen in terms of the Bedouin who are in the Negev desert.
Probably people were understanding you say in 48.
Duration at the time. Israel gained, the Jewish people gained their state in 1948. But at that time, 750,000 Palestinians were actually, they fled or were ejected from the land they were actually living in, which was extremely difficult. The settlement building, which also fragments the occupied Palestinian territories. So you've got a territory which is meant to be Palestinian land. There are actually illegal Jewish settlements growing, nearly half, and they're actually on Palestinian land. And it's all the infrastructure that goes with those colonies as well, in terms of the roads and the security, breaks up the Palestinian areas. On top of that, you've got segregation. Within Israel, there's the nationality status. There is no citizen status for Palestinians in Israel. The citizen, there are citizens. So you'll hear talk about that they've got equal rights as citizens within Israel, but they don't actually have national. They're not allowed to do military service. Now it's a two-edged thing. And also their rights to political participation and protest, that's not as freely available as it's led to relatively within Israel. I've just mentioned the fact they don't serve in the army, but there are restrictions in terms of the political activity the Palestinians can take part in Israel proper, but also obviously in the occupied territories, there's a military order 101, which is notorious for stopping any large gatherings by Palestinians. That's implemented immediately if there are congregations of people. And also the administrative detention, which I mentioned in terms of people being in prison without trial or charge. It's quite often used to decapitate political activists, organizations in occupied territories. They'll take away the leaders, people identified as the leaders in these Palestinian organizations, whether for human rights or some legal rights or better schooling, whatever it is. They will decapitate those organizations by arresting those people on security grounds. Now, the next video, short video, is about one aspect of that, and that's the prevention of family reunification. And it's about a couple in Israel who have not been able to actually live together.
Mohammed Khairi and his wife Majdaleen have been married for 6 months. They are Palestinian journalists that met in Istanbul while working for TRT Arabi. Mohammed has Israeli citizenship and Majdaleen has a Palestinian one. Mohammed says he set up a home in northern Israel, but Israel doesn't allow Majdaleen to enter the country and live there. Now, they live in Ramallah temporarily.
We're like many Palestinians who have many problems. Like thousands of Palestinian families, we have reunification problems, and we've chosen to go to Turkey or another country to build a normal life. But Israel didn't even allow my wife to do this and blocked her from leaving the country.
Majdaleen says Israel doesn't accept the necessary documentation needed for unification.
ذهبت إلى المخابرات.
I went to the Israeli intelligence to ask about the reason for their blocking. They told me that they don't know the reason and suggested I appeal to an Israeli court. We appealed to an Israeli court many times, and they told us that our case is a secret one that nobody can get information about.
Palestinians who are residents of the occupied West Bank and Gaza and married to Israelis are barred from obtaining permanent residency in Israel. It started with the Citizenship and Entry Law in 2003, and the legislation has been extended every year. It is now popularly known as Family Reunification Law. So far, around 12,700 Palestinians married to Palestinians who are Israeli citizens live there with temporary documentation. But they live almost in limbo. If their Israeli spouse die or they divorce, Palestinian children either have to leave the country or to move to the occupied West Bank or Gaza. Some Palestinian residents of the occupied West Bank whose wives or husbands live in Israel have to enter the country legally by climbing through a hole in the separation wall or by jumping over it to meet with their loved ones. They have to sneak in this way as Israel bans the free movement of Palestinian residents of the occupied West Bank in Israel over security concerns. But some politicians like Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid admits that the law ensures a Jewish majority in Israel. For Palestinian lawyers, it is just stating the obvious.
The draft law began as a project in the corridors of the General Security Agency, not to allow Palestinians to achieve the right to return through family reunification. Israelis see family reunification as the back door of the right to return, so it was decided under the pretext of security to close this door.
2 weeks ago, the Israeli parliament passed the first hearing of the extension of the law. If 2 more votes give a green light to the law, Mohammed and Majdaleen might have to postpone their dreams to live together in Israel and instead make a new home for themselves somewhere else in the world. Mustafa Fatih of TRT World, Occupied is Jerusalem.
On dispossession in a minute, that law was passed, it was reintroduced. So there's still difficulties for Palestinians who are married and want to cross those borders. And it's a blatant example of an apartheid policy, an apartheid state. Because of the fact it's obviously purely directed at Palestinians, and also it fits in quite nicely with the whole demographic control that Israel seeks to have over Palestinian movement and expansion and growth of any sort in their population, growth developmentally or growth in size. It's another way of actually controlling that growth and making sure there's no woolly wandering around of Palestinians to actually corrupt the apartheid project. Dispossession is another aspect, as I say, another strategy used. That's about the taking of forms of business and agricultural land across the occupied territories. That could be taken for any reason. It could be taken for enough security is the word that's bandied around freely, really for any reason. You've heard security mentioned a number of times. People not being allowed to reunite because of security concerns. We're never allowed to see what evidence, if there is any, what the concerns are about the person. And the same with the expropriation of land or the stopping of access to land within occupied territories. Security reasons are given. A lot of these things, unfortunately, come from the British mandate. A lot of the very good ideas the British came up with during the mandate were actually kept going by the Israelis because they found them quite useful. In 1943, there was an ordinance that basically allowed the Minister of Finance under the Brits to actually obtain land, have access to land and obtain land for any purpose. So it's a carte blanche really to seize land, seize somebody's land for the state. Israel continues with that because it seemed like a jolly good idea. The Absentee Property Law of 1950, following the 1948 catastrophe as far as the Palestinians were concerned and the creation of the Israeli state, that was really to ensure that because there was land sitting where Palestinian refugees hadn't been able to return to their houses, return to tend their land, it had been vacant, nobody tended to it for a period of time, it was seized by the Israeli state. Land Acquisition Law 53 followed on from that and was actually further extended. It was then land within Israel proper that hadn't actually, people haven't returned to it. That was seized also. So it's a general acquisition of land, which leads to a conclusion at the end, which is where 1948 Palestinians owed 90% of land, now it's down to 3.5%. So those measures have all worked in terms of excluding Palestinians from land and property. That continues. Moving on to deprivation. Gaza speaks for itself. I mean, it's just totally deprived. It's a chronic humanitarian disaster in terms of mental and physical health issues. There's always a shortage of medicines, a shortage of medical facilities. You can't get in or out, so you have to apply for permission to leave if you've got an illness of any sort. There was a baby died recently waiting to get out of Gaza for treatment in Israel. And also the water supply, 95% of it is not fit for human consumption. That's because the sewage works have been slammed several times with conflicts between Israel and Gaza. Each time they try to half repair any of the infrastructure in Gaza, it gets hit by another conflict. So the sewage and the waterworks there in very poor state, hardly operating at all. The medical facilities are operating at low level. Hospital schools are still operating on a shift basis because they were destroyed. Many of them were destroyed. So it's across all aspects of living. The Gazans are just surviving on a hand-to-mouth existence, and it's about 70–80% of the population are actually on international handouts. It's the only way they can actually survive, running its own out. Just denial of permits to build cloned structures. 95% of Palestinian applications for to build on their house with the occupied territories are denied. So you've got a situation of expanded population. You've got these Palestinian villages. They're actually kept within British mandated territorial boundaries. They're not allowed to expand beyond that in the villages. And within those, the houses, they're not allowed to be built on other, another floor put on or another expansion for, if the daughter or the son are getting married and want to expand. They're naturally expanding, and they just go ahead and do it. Now, as soon as they do that, it's noticed obviously by the Israelis, and they start a demolition order on it. So there are thousands of structures around the occupied territories with demolition orders against them. And this is at the same time up on the hill, they can see the expansion of the illegal settlements. So you've got that contrast. Again, it's a blatant aspect of the apartheid situation. Just the contrast, moving to East Jerusalem, the poverty levels in East Jerusalem compared to the Jewish families there. That actually goes into Israel proper as well. There aren't stats, there should be stats around Israel as well, because the financial and economic status, the educational status, and the health status of Israeli Arabs is always lesser than the Jewish population. It hits them in Israel as well. But East Jerusalem is particularly marked. And if you visit there, people have been to East Jerusalem, you can notice it just by walking around in terms of the infrastructure, the pavements, the lighting, it's quite decrepit. And that's despite the fact they actually pay their dues, the council tax, if you like, to the Jerusalem government, the Jerusalem municipality. They pay their dues, but it doesn't actually filter down to the Palestinian communities. Just another aspect. I mean, the Palestinian Authority has been unable, willing to, it's not been able to develop any sort of Palestinian self-governing, self-reliance at all. It's really static. It's just not able to operate. It hasn't got freedom of movement, politically or physically. And water, a very important aspect, obviously in the Middle East, it's a dry climate. It's very damning in the fact that Palestinians in the occupied territories, they get 70 litres per day per person, which I think is on the World Health Organization crisis line, compared to as it says there, the 389 litres that the Israeli settlers get. So you get Palestinian villages where they're on sporadic supply of water or electricity for that matter. But at the same time, they can see the settlements on the hills that will have sprinklers on their lawns, they'll have swimming pools. So again, you've got this stark contrast between what's happening for the Jewish population who are moving into that territory and the existing Palestinian native population. This next video, again, it's a relatively short one, but it's a Palestinian farmer, one of the Bedouin, talking about the encroaching impact of the encroachments of the Palestinian settlements on the Bedouin land.
نلعب رياضة، يعني نلعب الطبخ. عندك هي أكبر مني. نقرأ. أنا أمشي مع الوادي حتى أصل المدرسة. يعني درب طويل. إن شاء الله أكون أنا صرت ملك. إن شاء الله أكون أو دكتور أو معلم. حفظت النهار جو الجيش والإدارة. هون حطوا بيت نحن.
We suffer a lot from demolition orders, which came from the Israeli government. It's expected every day that they will demolish and you will lose your home, you will be homeless. Israeli settlers moved to our land illegally and never left. Now we live meters apart. They are our neighbors, but they didn't allow us to live with them so that later we can make some relations. It's not their land, it's controlled by force. I am Al-Mu'tasim Hadalin from Kharbet Al-Khair. We have lived and grazed our animals and sheep in our land, which my grandfather bought it in the beginning of 60s, so that we stay here and we live here from that time till today. We are here suffering from this occupation. We live here. Because they have all of the power, all of the weapons, they can do whatever they want. Nothing will prevent them because they are allowed to build animals. We are not allowed. Even we are the owners of this land. There is one law for them, another law for us. Israel state, it's supply all of the settlements with the electricity, with the roads, with water, with communications, but we are not allowed to get any of these services we installed solar systems so that we supply people with the renewable energy, and we will live with that. We will survive, so that every time they demolish anything, we will rebuild again, and we will stay here. If they live in peace, we will live in peace. But it is our right to live in our land. Our existence in our land is our way to protest non-violently against the occupation. As I feel about this land, it's like my mother. It's a motherland. I will stay till the last moment of my life. We will stay. Even we are homeless. Even we will stay on the land and we covered with the sky, we will stay here.
As Omar said there quite succinctly, it's one law for them, one law for us. In terms of the acts, these demolitions, the dispossession, which that was an example of, they're all part of the inhuman acts that actually are, that show that the apartheid system is being carried out. It's how it's carried out by these inhuman acts. And it does it with impunity, as it says there, because there, in terms of the excess violence, there are investigations by the army investigates itself. It does not take witness statements from usually Palestinians in terms of what has happened to somebody being shot and killed. They like investigate themselves. So hardly anybody, well, nobody's ever brought to justice for extrajudicial executions, which they are. But also you're talking about the inhumane acts in terms of the stopping of people on a daily basis, leaving their villages, throwing up flying picket lines to actually stop people moving around. There are lots of major and minor inhumane acts that come out on a daily basis for Palestinians, from the day they get up in the morning to the day they get time to go to bed. And as I said, there are lots of examples. If you do get a chance to look at it online, preferably, you can dip into their panels which give examples of each area where an inhumane act has been enacted. But you can get all the examples there. Let's say the admin detentions, the killings, the injuries, and the restrictions on social and cultural rights, etc. Now, moving on, I'm going to end what I'm glad to hear. The campaign, in terms of what Amnesty hopes to get from all this, because this has been existing for a long time, which we've all got questions of, how is this going to change anything? What Amnesty is hoping is that eventually, in terms of theory of change, this tank is moving along, this tank of apartheid with Israel against the Palestinians, and that it's not deviating. There's been no cost to it. It's just moving forward inexorably, because there's no cost to it. So what Amnesty is trying to do is actually shout at the world and tell them to underline, along with other organizations, the state of this. Because once the Palestinians themselves, the state that this is an apartheid situation, it's recognized internationally as being a crime against humanity, and therefore every country is obliged, is obligated to actually take some action about that. So that's the aim, is to actually make it more comfortable for the Israelis, at least, as people get to know more about it, although they should know by now. It's also supporting on a smaller scale, supporting any human rights defenders. That's what an HRD is. Any human rights defenders within or without Israel, Palestine, in their attempts to try to gain justice for Palestinian people. So it's supporting them. That's been done over the years. And in terms of the objectives, it's increasing your awareness of the apartheid system, what it means, as a whole, really, not just as an occupation in the occupied territories, or what's happening to Gaza, or these strictures on people in East Jerusalem. It's the fact that this is overall is an apartheid situation that you're looking at, learning that, and also actually then sharing that with, discussing that with your friends and neighbors and anybody, and eventually your political representatives. We're not at that point yet, we will do. It's also expected that third states, as I say, should recognize their obligations under international law to actually do something about the fact that this crime is an ongoing crime and people are committing it today. And also, I would hope that the Israeli authorities actually cease and change their policies. So that's what the campaign aims. And what's being focused on currently is actually the home. Now, home is being seen as a Palestinian's home. You know, we've all got homes, something that everybody can identify with. So the idea is that we try to say how difficult it is for Palestinians to actually live their lives in their homes, to actually maintain just an orderly, secure home life against this setting of living in an apartheid state. Now, there's just the last video I'm going to show is again a short one, 3-minute one. And it's a recent film that's been developed by Amnesty with a Palestinian director. It's just to show the impact on a family in their home.
تيجي تساعدني هاي الرزق اخته؟
يلا يلا أنا معك يلا يا سلام
تعالوا ليه هيك وجهك؟ انت اليوم تحممت.
الله يعطيك العافية.
ايش عم تعملوا؟ ايش عم تعمل؟
مش اتفقنا ننزل الباب؟
اتفقنا ندعم الباب بس هاي داعي خلوهم صرنا سنين محافظين على
يا
هاي.
حبيبي ده الباب بس أنا الشقة عايز عيننا طول ها؟
يلا ماما كنت مفضلة يلا حبيبتي. لحظة لا سكر وش
خلاص مشيها.
نفسي.
And that's you specifically is relating to the eviction in East Jerusalem, obviously, where you've got Jewish settlers being moved into Palestinian houses, where there's been some discussion in courts about who actually has the right to the house, and it's always the settlers that will at some point. And that's still ongoing, and it's still ongoing as we speak, really, in East Jerusalem, and will continue to do so. It's just another aspect of the fact that Palestinians in any part of Israel occupied territories, in terms of going to bed at night, what they wake up to in the morning, they can be at risk of military assault in terms of Gaza, right through to, your child being snatched in the night, so your house isn't secure in that way. Being able to maintain a job, if you work in Israel with the checkpoints, but also in terms of your home being secure, not being allowed to really live in the area, because it's all about demographics for the Israeli authorities. It's about changing these demographics. They've got figures in their heads regards how many Jews and how many Palestinians should be in East Jerusalem. They're working towards that. And that goes for Israel and what is termed Greater Israel, Eretz Israel, the occupied territory, Judea, Samaria, as they refer to it. That is the aim. It's an apartheid policy which is pursuing towards those ends. And that's the intent which is needed in terms of defining an apartheid state, an apartheid policy. There's an end intent in terms of oppressing Palestinians and boxing them into those corners and into those segments of the land and segments of society, so that the Jewish majority can actually sustain their, fulfill their future at the expense of those other people. Now, Amnesty being realistic and having done numbers of campaigns around the world on various issues, this is the timeline. We're not talking about tomorrow, we're not talking about next year or the next 5 years. Recognition in a year or two by the international community, some acknowledgement that apartheid is actually existing in Israel and occupied territories would be good. That's an aim point. If we get in a year or two, we get some signs of recognition, people admitting, not just saying we're anti-Semitic, but actually saying, what are they talking about? Have you actually read the report? What about the facts in the report? In Human Rights Watch's report, Betzelen's report, the UN reports, what about those facts? What are you doing about them? So getting recognition, some discussion going on about the apartheid system existing. Taking action, for Amnesty, that means moving forward eventually to quite soon to actually taking issue with your political representative as regards to what they're doing. Have they read the report? This is international human rights law? What do they say about it? What do they believe it or not? Why do they not believe it? So it's actually pressing for action for our political representatives at that level, but also Amnesty pressing the UK government for it to do its part as well as other sections pressing their governments, and obviously everybody pressing the UN to try and take some action. That's the aim. But then eventually you hope, the long-term aim is that 6 to 8 years' time, maybe 10 years' time, we might actually get some accountability for what's being done at the moment and what may be continuing at that time, 8, 10 years' time. So Amnesty is not optimistic. It's not got stars, it's not wearing rose-tinted glasses in terms of saying this apartheid report is really going to crack things open there. It's, other reports have come out. Amnesty does have some status, and the report is very sound in terms of its research and the evidence in the report. So hopefully we may get some movement, but it's not optimistic. It just knows it's going to be a long grind. There's a lot of opposition to this report. So that's the timeline at the current time. Sorry, just in terms of recommendation to the UK government specifically, because you obviously most control, if any, over that. Recognising apartheid, that would be a start, as opposed to saying we're using the wrong language at the moment. They wouldn't use that language, I think is the term they use. Banning settlement goods, that's been around for some time. That's not new. Settlement goods to be clearly labelled whether they are or not. And then not to be taken into by the UK. That again, it's been around for some time, which is suspending arms and security equipment sales. That relationship, business relationship with Israel. And also, if we do get the UK government anywhere near to acknowledging apartheid, like any other third party, any other country in the world that has its obligation, that fulfills its obligation to actually look at bringing perpetrators in Israel to justice. That would mean Israeli authority figures not being able to travel around the world. They're actually being fearful, as they have been on occasions in the past with Gaza assaults, of going into certain countries in case they're arrested for having committed crimes under international law. That would be the idea. And obviously, knowing what it knows now, if it's not already doing it, using diplomatic and political tools to lean on the Israeli authorities to change what they're doing. Now, as you'll know, if you write any letters to the UK government or have any contacts, we're constantly told that the UK is making representations and has discussed this incident and that event with Israeli authorities. That's all we can hear. There's not much pressure applied as far as we can tell, because there's no sign of no evidence of any changes as a result of these approaches. But certainly we'd be calling for more serious approaches to Israelis on the apartheid situation. Businesses, again, that's been around for a little while in terms of not propping up the system of apartheid, and that's particularly in respect of the illegal settlements in the occupied territories, not propping up the infrastructure, not selling them electricity and gas and security measures, all those things, and all the commercial stuff, the advertisements for having a nice day in Israel, which is actually a settlement, you later discovered. All those forms of support for the settlement economy have been stopped. And then lastly, in terms of yourself getting involved, Amnesty's been very cautious about how groups and individual members accept this report. It's a very dense report, although a lot of it is actually known to you. A lot of it are action events and policies that have been around for some decades now from Israel against the Palestinians. But it's giving groups and individuals time to actually absorb the report. There is an education module on the AI UK site. I can send individuals here the link after. But if you go into the UK site, it's in the same page under what we do, and then you get the Israel and Palestine references, and later under you get the resources, and the petition is in that site as well, and also the education module. It takes about 90 minutes. It runs through all these things. You can go through it at your own pace. It's just further grounding for feeling confident about speaking to other people about this report and the situation. The resources that are available as well, there are leaflets that are currently available. There will be a summary coming out, and there will be other resources coming out in the future as well. And when you feel confident of actually holding an event, a public event, not like this one necessarily, but even out in the public, because we need to actually get the message out there as well. Or meeting with your political representative when you feel more confident. So there are a number of ways to get involved at this stage, but Amnesty will have other actions coming out as time goes on. And that's all I'm saying now, the time was. So sorry about the glitches. I'm sorry I've gabbled a lot. I tend to, because I'm always actually not getting through everything because it's so dense. And sorry it's not totally uplifting, which it never is. But there is an opportunity with the report. It's a tool. It's a very good tool to actually use in discussing the issues with your friends, your neighbours, and with your political representatives. Hopefully it will be remain a good solid tool for use in the work in the future. So,
Great.
Okay, thanks very much, Garry, for that really interesting report. Those last two films I found particularly moving, especially the second to last one with the little boy and then witnessing